Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Duty Optimization through Tariff Engineering and HTS Classification. My name is Jenn Park. I am the Director of the Trade Advisory Service here at Flexport. We have a great webinar for you today, but before we begin, let's go over a few housekeeping items. On your screen, you will see a sidebar to the right of the main stage. If at any time you need assistance during the live webinar, please message us in the help chat located at the sidebar. You can also ask questions via the Q&A tab. Time permitting, at the end of the presentation, we will answer a few audience questions. Be sure to get your questions in early. In the menu above the screen, you have two tabs. In the first tab, you can download a copy of today's slide deck. And in the second tab, there is a brief feedback survey for the webinar. We love your feedback, so please fill out that before exiting the webinar. Now, a brief legal note. Please keep in mind that all information provided in the session is based on the situation at the current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. Joining me today is my colleague, Benny Sirkin, our Senior Trade Advisory Associate, who helps manage our classification service here at Flexport. Moving to today's agenda, we will kick things off by discussing what is HTS classification and why is HTS classification important. Then we'll move over to discussing tariff engineering and seeing how Flexport can help you. And then we will close it out with some Q&A. So I'll hand it off to Benny to help discuss what is HTS classification.
Yes, so next slide, please. Classification in its simplest form is the act of assigning a numeric HTS code from the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States, or the HTS US, to a product for the purpose of importation. US HTS codes are 10 digits, and you can see a little anatomical graphic on the right-hand side of this slide that will show you this. So the first 6 digits of the code are typically harmonized, and this means that those 6 digits will usually be the same for a product when you're importing it to different countries. However, this is not always the case. There are instances where you will see countries that classify goods in an entirely different manner than other countries. And those 6 digits can be broken down into 3 parts. So the first 2 digits will identify the chapter in which the goods are classified. The second 2 are going to be the heading within that chapter, and then the last 2 would identify the subheading within that chapter. The subsequent 4 digits will make the entire HTS code, and the last 2 digits of this are known as the statistical suffix in the tariff schedule. So this is where the complete article description is, and the last 4 will ultimately determine the final classification as well as the duty. And you may see on product invoices that your supplier will provide you with an HTS code. But we did want to note that many suppliers will provide the origin variation of the HTS code, and even if they do provide a classification for the correct country of import or destination, there is no guarantee that the classification itself is correct. So that's important to note. And in the US, the HTS is updated at least twice a year, sometimes more. And then globally, there's an overhaul every 5 years. So these changes are studied really closely by customs brokers who are well versed in this. And because of this, we do recommend that importers seek expert advice on this. So as a best practice, it's always recommended for classification purposes to consult a professional. Classification is considered customs business, so this is very important, and it should be conducted by a licensed customs broker or someone with specific expertise in classification. As many of you know, I'm sure misclassifications can be very, very costly in some cases and lead to serious supply chain issues as well. So having a specialized classification professional to assess your products, you can assign the most accurate HTS code to them. You can ensure compliance, minimize issues with customs authorities. And if you have any questions about classification, feel free to reach out to classification@flexport.com at the end of this webinar. We have a really great team of extremely well-versed experts that can help with virtually any type of commodity. So as you can see, classification is a difficult subject to master. So in the next slide, I'm going to discuss a little bit about the process of arriving to a classification. So classifications are determined by taking certain product attributes into account. You'll notice that when and if you do ask a trade professional to assign your products a classification, they're going to ask for very detailed information about your products. So some of these can consist of a detailed product description, which will help us understand what the product is, how it's used, its primary function, the bill of materials. So what is the product made of? Is it plastic? Is it metal? Is it textile? This can influence classification most of the time. Sometimes we will also ask for gender, color, size, and cost if this is applicable. Some items classifications will be determined by this. This information is not available for all products, of course, but if this is available, it's great to provide this to the professional that's assigning your product the classification. Function and purpose are also used. So how is the product used? Is it, a consumer electronic? Is it industrial technology? Is it a clothing piece that's going to be worn by an end user? And then form and condition provide the status of the product. So is this product that you're importing a finished product? Is it incomplete? Will it ultimately be part of a larger assembly? Is it raw in form? Is it processed? And then lastly, an image can also provide additional details that are helpful when classifying. Sometimes the image will show details that we have initially forgotten about. What we do tell clients when they come to us for classification projects is just to provide as much information as you possibly can. Even if we've not asked for certain details specifically, everything helps. So next slide, please. And these classifications are also, determined by consulting the following sources. All of these details are taken into account. And in order to assign a product classification, a professional is typically going to consult these sources. So first we have the 6 GRIs. And these are just 6 international rules that we consult when producing a classification. Chapter, section, and explanatory notes. Any informed compliance publications, which are great. These are issued by CBP, and they initially help importers comply with U.S. customs laws. They provide pretty detailed guidance, and we reference these a lot when producing classifications. Product-specific binding rulings. So, if you do have a product and you are unsure of the classification and you would like some additional guidance, coming to us, having us write a binding ruling to CBP to confirm the classification of your product is really helpful in the long run. And we consult these, of course, when we're developing them. And then the cross database also, which is a database that shows past binding rulings for similar products. We consult those as well as other licensed professionals asking for their opinions, those that specialize in classification. So now we're going to have Jenn talk about why HTS classification is so important for importers.
All right, thank you, Benny. Okay, next slide. All right, so I'm going to cover why HTS classification is important, especially on formal entries when a company is acting as the importer of record. I know Benny mentioned a few in the beginning, but I wanted to kind of cover a little bit more in detail. So for customs compliance, every information that's declared to customs is the importer's responsibility. So if a company is acting as the IOR, every information that's declared on a customs entry is ultimately your responsibility. And customs has the standard of reasonable care that an importer should be portraying in whenever they declare the information. So we always ask clients, every information must be correct, but specifically there are 3 areas that we want to focus on, which is classification, country of origin, and value. The reason why these 3 are important is because that's what determines the value of your goods being imported. So ultimately the revenue that you're paying that customs will receive. So you want to make sure that classification is important because there are other impacts to it, right? When we do classification, you understand what the duty is going to be, but also that will help us kind of determine, is there a Section 301 tariff tied to that product? Also, that has to do with country of origin, but it also identifies any anti-dumping, any quotas, any embargoes, any other restrictions that may be available for your products. Classification is a great way to kind of identify all of that up front, so that you're kind of prepared in terms of, when you're importing a good, what kind of restrictions or tariffs or anti-dumping duties are involved, so that it prepares you and you're not finding that out at the time of clearance and your broker is reaching out. And going back to customs compliance, I just want to kind of call out that even though the broker is actually making the declaration on your behalf, it is the employer's responsibility. So you'll always want to make sure that you're giving the correct information to your broker for them to declare. Another area why this is important is, it is an opportunity to identify potential cost savings opportunities for companies. Whenever we work with companies that reach out to us, especially now that, the 301 tariff exclusions have gone away, we do have a lot of clients reaching out, worried that, the 25% tariffs that they didn't have to pay historically for the past 4 years are now into play, and they need to figure out how they're going to account for that cost, right? And so we're working with them to kind of figure out what are some cost saving strategies for them while they're still trying to pay that 25% tariff. And so what we'll do is we'll start with classification, but we'll always want to look to see if there's any exclusions. We do have companies that still don't know that there are exclusions available and were available. So we'll do kind of an exclusion review, and that's always tied to the classification. But also it allows us to see if there's any FTAs that may be available, if there's a tariff engineering opportunity, origin engineering. But there's other duty savings opportunities, but classification, I would say, is kind of like the main focal point to start in identifying all of the different opportunities that may be available for each of the different companies. And then last, I would say, not having the correct classification could ultimately lead to civil and criminal penalties. So you just want to make sure that, you don't want to be in a situation where you're using the incorrect classification for several years and customs finds that you were negligent, grossly negligent in that, and that it ultimately leads to potential penalties for a company. So, all right, next slide. Working with a lot of companies, I would say the first and probably the easiest way to identify a duty saving opportunity is essentially just reevaluating your classification. It's actually surprising to see how many companies are using an incorrect classification. Our team has found millions in savings every year just by changing a classification for a company. So I would say that's like the simplest way, because all you have to do is reclassify your products to see if you're using ultimately the correct classification. And a lot of times when we work with companies, there are reasons why a company may be using the classification that they are. It's not that they're intentionally using the incorrect one. Some of the reasons that we've kind of highlighted here on this slide, and it's because it was a classification that was provided by their overseas vendor manufacturer, and I would say 99% of the time it's usually incorrect. So if that's your case, I would say it's probably a good step to kind of reevaluate your classifications to make sure that you are using the US classification, right? A lot of times when Benny mentioned earlier, when assessing classifications, the first 6 digits may be aligned, but what they're providing at the vendor side is their origin classification at times, and so it does not apply to the US. And so you want to make sure that even though that the vendor had provided you a classification, you're doing your own due diligence and reviewing that to make sure it's correct on the US side. Other ones are that that it was provided by the competitor is using it, so they're going to use it because it has a lower duty rate. I would say please don't use a classification just because your competitor is using it, because it's not a good excuse, and it's usually sometimes not the correct one. So, and then other ones are, there was a lot of turnover within the internal company. They don't know where the classification came from, but it's been used for several years, so they're just continuing to use it. Or someone that was in logistics or legal happened to kind of take over trade compliance because there weren't enough resources. And so they're now tasked with doing classification. So they may not have the right expertise, but they have to get it done. So they're assigning classification codes. So, just making sure that the person who is handling classification does have a certain level of expertise in classifying, because as Benny mentioned in the previous slides, it does take a lot of work in order to classify accurately. There are a lot of rules. There are a lot of references that need to be looked at in order to make sure that the correct classification is being applied to each product depending on the different attributes involved. And I would say for best practice, if you're not doing an annual review, is something that we always recommend. Here in the US tariff schedule is being updated at least twice a year, globally once every 5 years. And then there's always new rulings coming out. So you just want to make sure that you're on top of all the classification changes that are happening. And then if it does impact your products, that you're making the right steps to correct those classifications or change it if needed. Also, if you have products, one thing that we do struggle with during our classification service at times is working with companies that don't have any sort of product detail. If for your products, it's great to work with your, product design team, product development team, making sure that there's detailed documentation available on your products, the material composition, any tech specs on all the different functions of your product, because you just want to make sure that there are detailed record keeping available for each of your products, because as Benny mentioned, we're looking for every single fact available to make sure that the most accurate classification is being applied to your products. And then I would say if you're doing classifications in-house and you have that expertise, always make sure that there's supporting evidence to kind of guide you through why you determine the classification that you're currently using. If customs does reach out with a CF29 asking for information on why the classification, why you're using the classification that you are today, you want to make sure that not only do you have all the information available on the facts of your products, but also kind of a reasoning as to how you got to that classification. So you only have about 20 days to respond to that CF28 should you get it. So you just want to make sure it's all readily available so you're able to timely respond. All right. And then one thing that I do want to call out before we move on to tariff engineering is that the reason why you're able to kind of save a lot doing a reclassification effort is that, if we do identify an incorrect classification and it turns out that a new classification that you should be using has a lower duty rate, there is an opportunity for companies to file post-summary corrections to, get those refunds back from customs. So, depending on the time period and when the entry was declared, it is possible to file, post-summary corrections or protests with customs to request that duty difference. And that's how you're able to retroactively receive the refunds. But also, going forward, using the correct classification, obviously, you'll be paying a lower duty rate going forward as well. Yeah. All right, Benny, can you walk us through tariff engineering?
Absolutely. So let's take a dive now into tariff engineering. Aside from classification reevaluation, this is also a great way for importers to save on duties. It's another critical concept of international trade. While HTS classification is about compliantly classifying your products, tariff engineering is a little different, and it's about strategically modifying your products or the components of your products to get a different classification. And usually this is to benefit from either lower duties, duty exemptions, or even trade agreement benefits. This process will never involve misclassifying or intentionally falsifying the details of your product to achieve a different classification. That's tariff evasion, because tariff engineering is the legal and proactive way to do this to minimize customs duties. So companies that understand the nuances of tariff regulations can potentially save millions of dollars annually through this strategy. And ultimately, the goal is to manufacture, package, or assemble products in such a way that the importer will benefit in one of a number of ways. So, why is this important? What can we do for importers with this? Tariff engineering, of course, as mentioned, can provide cost savings. This is the most obvious advantage of tariff engineering, and depending on the product and its classification, the tariffs can range from either 0% base duty to sometimes even over 100%, depending on what the product is, 100% of the product's value, that is. So with tariff engineering, companies can save millions, like I said, by importing these goods at a lower duty rate, helping to cushion their margins a little bit. And supply chain flexibility is another benefit. So tariff engineering can influence a lot of decisions for importers regarding sourcing and manufacturing their products. And companies might choose to source materials or components from certain countries to take advantage of favorable tariff rules or even different trade agreements. And it allows for a little bit more flexibility when it comes to managing your global supply chains and hopefully reduce overall costs. And then lastly, we have compliance and risk mitigation. So again, unlike tax evasion or purposeful misclassification, tariff engineering is a completely legal practice. So companies that engage in this practice, this legal practice of tariff engineering, will remain compliant with customs laws, and you can ultimately reduce the risk of fines, penalties, and even CBP audits, which is great. So up next, we have a few examples of tariff engineering. So I did want to preface this actually by saying that while the accuracy of the sample classifications that we have in here have been developed to the best of our knowledge, The classifications might not apply directly to your products, even if the attributes seem to be identical or are identical. So please just consult with a trained compliance professional before you assume the classifications here that are shown in these examples for your own imports. And please also keep in mind that the duty rates that we've provided at the bottom of each of these examples here only take into account the base duty rate, and there is no potential additional duty rate that's added that sometimes occurs with goods of certain origins. Chinese origin goods will sometimes have a 301 duty attached to them. That is not accounted for here. So with that said, let's take a look at the tariff engineering example for textiles and apparel. So this is by far the most common type of tariff engineering that we see as a team. That is the tariff engineering of apparel items. So by changing what seem like fairly minor details, in this sweater, for example, the material composition, it's a very, very minor detail, or it seems to be that way to, someone just looking at this. You could potentially cut the duty rate owed on an imported product significantly. So in this example, you will see on the left here, we have a sweater that is a mix of 82% polyester, 15% cashmere, and 3% elastane. That's the original sweater. And that has a base duty rate of 32% under that classification. So by modifying the material composition of this sweater, so we then have a 65% polyester, 32% cashmere, and 3% elastane sweater, we have a different classification, and the result of that differing classification is ultimately a much lower duty rate. So we've jumped from 32% down to 17%. Next slide, please. And then here we have probably the most famous example of tariff engineering, possibly of all time. So if you own a pair of Converse All-Star sneakers, you may wonder why the soles of them have what seem to be like a felt material on the bottom part of the rubber sole. And you might be interested to know that this has everything to do with duty rates. So the felt on your soles is actually something called flocking. And essentially, this is the process where the outsole of the shoe has contact with the ground, and it's treated with a certain type of fiber. So typically a synthetic material, tiny fibers that are stuck to the rubber sole of the shoe. In this example, you can see that the value of the shoe is at $6. And this has a classification that carries a duty rate of 37.5%. And this is the rubber sole without the flocking. Converse realized this a number of years ago. I believe it was over a decade ago. And they decided to look at the soles of their shoes and cover them with flocking, the same shoes with the same value. And it's a very inexpensive treatment for these shoe soles. And it resulted in an enormous duty reduction that happened using this very inexpensive and pretty simple method. And it really doesn't change the integrity of the shoe, which is great. So next slide, please. And then this is an example that I've seen a fair number of times in real life as well with holiday decor. So not sure if many of you know this, but typically any decorative item will be classified as the material that it's composed of. So if you have, a metal figurine, that would probably be classified as metal. In this case, this snow globe, it looks like it's mostly glass, not sure what the bottom's made of, but assuming it is glass, that would probably be classified as glass in Chapter 70, glassware of a kind used for decor. And that carries a 7.2% general duty rate. However, the right image shows a snow globe with an obvious Santa Claus figurine inside. If a decorative item is looking to be, intended to be festive for a specific holiday, so Christmas, Hanukkah, whatever it may be, the importer might have an opportunity to claim that it is a festive article, which carries a 0% duty rate. So this is a great example of that. By changing what seems to be a pretty minor detail about a product, you could bring the duty rate down from whatever it is as its original classification to 0, as long as it is considered a festive article. Next slide, please. And then lastly, this final example of tariff engineering is for candy. So this process can also be used for food products. It's not just for regular consumer goods. So here, importers can take advantage of lower duty rates by adjusting certain ingredients in their products. On the left, we have a chocolate bar that's made of 90% or more by dry weight of sugar, and that carries a duty rate of 33.6 cents per kilogram. And then on the right, it looks like the sugar has been reduced to less than 65%. And therefore, we can also reduce the duty rate to 21.7 cents per kilogram, general duty rate. So, while it is great and it could be a cost-saving initiative, some importers in this case might wonder about the integrity of the candy bar's taste. And this, of course, is a challenge that tariff engineering presents. So we're going to touch a little bit on the challenges of tariff engineering in the next slide. So as I've said, tariff engineering is not without its challenges. First, there's the complexity of the tariff schedule. Tariff engineering does require a pretty deep understanding of the HTS US and trade agreements, as well as how they apply to different products. So the rules can be very complex and they can differ from country to country. So it is important to consult with someone who has knowledge on this. Product design and quality. Importers can alter their products to fit a more favorable tariff classification. This can be done very often, but they should think about whether the changes compromise the product's feel, quality, functionality. For example, in the sweater example that we looked at, changing the material composition of that sweater to a higher percentage of cashmere might be great for that. And it might result in a better feel of the sweater, and consumers might be more willing to buy it then. However, in the example with the candy bar, the sugar content is reduced. So does it affect the taste to the point that the customers wouldn't want to purchase it? So these are all things to consider when going into research and development to change your product's attributes. And then the cost of re-engineering. So modifying a product's design, composition, packaging, all of this can incur additional costs. So companies should weigh the savings that they can achieve through tariff engineering with the potential costs to see if the savings do outweigh the costs that it takes to re-engineer. And then legal and ethical considerations. While tariff engineering is legal, as I mentioned, it must be done transparently. Steps must be taken to ensure that the changes are made within the bounds of the law. This is very important. And then lastly, a collaboration between various teams that are looking at the product changes. So whether it's internal design, engineering, the sourcing teams, and even external trade compliance teams that you've outsourced help from, need to seamlessly work together to determine which changes can be made and how they can be made. And because of this, we have some best practices listed here that we suggest when importers begin to think about this process. So firstly, having product details and text specifications readily available. So when you're reviewing your product design, your composition, your sourcing, and your manufacturing details with your product teams, you want to gather those details. And for all of the products that you may consider trying tariff engineering for, wherever you may be willing to save money, present this information to a trade professional to see if there are any opportunities that you can be taking advantage of. And then next, stay aware of opportunities that are presented to make changes. So we would recommend that you would work with a trade compliance professional, as I mentioned, to evaluate this. They can make you aware of these changes that you can make to your products or even your sourcing countries, because that can help save costs as well. And then fostering collaboration. So once your trade compliance team, internal team, or external places where you've outsourced help from, has identified an opportunity, you might want to collaborate with your internal and external teams to make sure that you can make those changes in a compliant way. And Jen, I'm sure clients are wondering how Flexport can help. So can you walk us through how our team can assist?
All right, I'm sure with all the information, everyone's wondering, where do we start? For those that are well-versed in their own classifications, I'm sure it's as simple of just kind of moving forward, reviewing the classifications, but I wanted to kind of start from like the beginning. So if you're a company that is not, well-versed in how many imports you have, what are your top products, we always recommend an ACE analysis, which is provided by Flexport. For those of you that don't know, ACE is the Automated Commercial Environment, which is CBP's database that holds, your historical US import data. So every company that imports will have an ACE account, and will have their, can get their data from this portal. But what you don't know is it's not as user friendly, and it's unstructured data. So when you go into ACE, it's just lines of data. And what Flexport has developed is a proprietary tool that will take this unstructured data and put it into a very user-friendly, digestible report. So you can see your year over year, which is a 5-year look back of, how much entry declared, how much duty was paid, who are all your brokers that declared your entries, the MIDs, the country of origin, country of export. It has all the details, but it's in a way where you can actually see the different trends, see the actual values, and it's easy to really understand. And what the good thing about this ACE analysis is that it now gives you the data and the information to kind of look to see, are there any compliance risks? Were there any MIDs that should not have been declared, or country of exports that should not have been declared? But one thing that we do like in this ACE analysis, or my team does, is that there is a product overview. So all the different classifications that were declared, and it will show you what were the top HTS classifications that were declared, how much value was associated, how much duty was associated with it. So you're able to kind of understand, where are you paying the highest duties, which classification? And then based on that, you can kind of identify internally, what products kind of fell within those classifications, to kind of identify, any risk, any opportunities. So it is a great tool. It is free of charge that Flexport does provide, but it is a great way to kind of understand your historical data. We found that, clients find this really useful, especially for internal, not just for trade compliance teams, but, financial teams, also, team members that may be new to the company, to kind of understand how the company has been importing for the past 5 years. It's a great look back to have, but a great tool to kind of, prepare your financials and your, future imports as well. So we would say that if you want a place to start, or if you're just interested in ACE analysis to understand more about your import and historical data, ACE analysis is probably the first step. Other ways that Flexport can help is that I've already kind of mentioned, we do have a classification team here at Flexport. They're all licensed customs brokers, specialized in classification, that have been doing this, and we do classify for all industries. So if you don't have the expertise in-house, or you just want a second look at a classification that you've been using, you're more than happy to, partner with us to have our team take a look at your classifications and assist with that. We also provide customized trainings and workshops. We have a lot of clients reaching out saying, we want to build it in-house on our classifications. So is there someone that's available to kind of come virtually or in person to kind of not only train us on what classification is, but how to classify our own products? And so we do provide that customized training, whether it's virtual or in person. And we do kind of detail it to how you want that session to run. So it's not a set, this is what we're going to cover and that's it, but we do kind of work with you in terms of making sure that it fits your needs. And last is that we do have a lot of clients reaching out to our consulting team here, our trade advisory team, to kind of understand, are there any duty savings opportunities, which could go just beyond tariff engineering and classification review. So, we have these conversations, and during that call, I'm speaking with clients to kind of understand their supply chain, the facts, more about their company, and what, flexibility that they have, so that we can kind of identify other duty savings strategies for them. Is it, is there something we can do with value? So is there a first sale that we can implement? Or is there something to do with country of origin? Can you do origin engineering, potentially moving your supply chain or your manufacturing or your sourcing, even if it's not everything, just a little bit of it, that would achieve a different country of origin, so that you're no longer, paying the Section 301 tariffs if you're currently paying them today. So there are a lot of different conversations that we're having today with clients to identify potential duty savings opportunities, especially like I mentioned before. The 301 tariff exclusions have gone away. A lot of clients are in a position where they're now paying a lot more duties than they were historically. So they are looking at other avenues to reduce their duties. All right, we'll go to the next slide. And I wanted to kind of provide some more insight on our Flexport classification process. I know a lot of clients we do have a lot of Flexport classification clients, but I wanted to kind of give an overview for those that didn't know we had one, or just how our process works. We want to make it very simple and standard as possible for our clients. We know that, classification is probably not the top priority for a lot of companies. They don't have dedicated resources. So we want to make it as easy as possible where we can partner up with you and make sure that we're the ones handling for you. And all you have to do is, feed us the data. We give you the classifications. And so this is our standard process. We have it here, whereas intake, which is basically our onboarding, there's different ways that we customize it for our clients depending on how we can get the data from you. There are companies that want to do direct integrations. There are companies that, don't have that capability. So they would rather just send us that they send us like their CSV files or their Excel sheets, or, we have our own templates that we gather these product details. And like Benny mentioned, ultimately, this is a step where we want to gather everything about your product, every fact possible, because we want to make sure that we're classifying the product accurately. So the more details they can provide, this is where we're going to be doing the product gathering and the product information gathering. So this is the intake. And then once we get that information, we'll classify it within our team, and then we'll perform an audit, making sure that, we're doing that secondary review to make sure the classifications we are providing are accurate. And then the last step is upload. This comes in various forms. We can do direct integration, send it back to your team. We can send it via email, send it back in a template in which we received it from. So there are ways that we can customize the service. It's not just a one-step process or one type of process for that we provide, but we do work with clients to kind of understand how they want to send us data and how they want to receive the data, and then we kind of customize it as well. One thing I do want to highlight here, besides our standard SLAs and pricing, is that our classification service is not just providing HTS classifications. We go beyond that, and we do provide duty rates. But other than those two, we do have the capability of providing any Section 301 exclusions that we may be able to identify during the classification review. In addition to that is checking to see if there's any anti-dumping on the product. It is not 100% accurate because, as you know, anti-dumping could be flagged at the classification, but also product details or product description is also taken into consideration. But at least this will kind of identify whether the classification is flagged. And if it is, then we can conduct a further review to see if it actually is within the scope of any anti-dumping orders. But so we check for anti-dumping flags, PGA flags. So if your products may be subject to any EPAs, FDAs, we're able to kind of catch that during our review. And then lastly, if there are any FTAs that may be available for your products. So these are all flags. So it's great to understand. I know a lot of clients that have come to us after they've imported, not only realizing that they didn't know their products are subject to anti-dumping or that they had a PGA requirement. And so it's causing delays at the time of clearance. So this is a perfect way to be able to be more proactive and be able to capture all this data prior to shipping so that you can prepare, whether it's a certificate for PGA or whether it's for anti-dumping, confirming that it's not subject to anti-dumping. And so you're able to understand your costs and what duties you're actually going to be paying, and not being surprised at the end when you get your invoice and find out that your products now are subject to Section 301 or anti-dumping, because we do have situations where clients are alarmed only to find that out after they import. So you just this is an opportunity to be able to identify all that prior to. All right, and I think I'll invite Benny back up so we can go through our Q&A. And I'll start with a question for you, Benny. All right. So for companies that are interested in pursuing tariff engineering, how would you suggest they choose which products to start with?
So for companies that are interested in pursuing tariff engineering, I would suggest they look at two things. One, the products that they import at the highest volumes, and then two, the products that they import that have the highest duty rates. If importers don't have that data on hand, we can perform an ACE analysis that will help them determine this. Like Jen mentioned, these are provided by our trade advisory team, and that report will give you a good indicator of both of those factors. So those two spots are great indicators of where importers would be paying the most duties. So they might want to look in this direction first. At that time, we'd advise that they gather all of the necessary data for their products and then get in touch with a trade professional with tariff engineering experience.
Okay.
Jen, it looks like this one's for you. DDP import orders. Which party is liable for classification errors?
So for DDP, that means it's delivered duty paid, and so the customs duties are all kind of handled by the seller, not the buyer in this instance. So it would be the seller that's going to be responsible for the classification errors because it's them that's going to be responsible for the customs declarations, what they're declaring to customs, including classification and the duties that are being paid. All right. Let's see. All right, Benny, what if reclassifying results in a higher duty? Will CBP claw back?
So Jenn, if you want to give your thoughts here too, that might help as well. But if it's determined that a classification was originally incorrect and then it's changed and then it results in a higher duty, CBP will claw back if it's determined that the importer knowingly classified the item incorrectly, or if the classification that they initially imported with is grossly misused. As long as the importer is using reasonable conduct and practicing reasonable care, it's likely that CBP will understand this error. But Jenn, if you want to offer more thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I would say if you're using the incorrect code and reclassifying, we're not doing tariff engineering, we're just looking at the product itself, and the correct classification is actually different and it has a higher duty rate associated with it, which is common. It could go both ways, right? Tariff engineering or reclassifying. The benefit of that is there is a potential where you could have a new classification with lower duty, but on the flip side, there is a scenario where you may actually have a new classification with a higher duty. In those instances, from a compliance perspective, that's my professional. What I would recommend is that you still want to make that correction because you want to make sure that every information that declared to customs is correct. So even though it results in a higher duty, we would always recommend making sure to file that correction with customs, letting them know that that you've misused or you've had a misclassification and that you pay the duties that are different. So it might be more duties, but it's not always beneficial for tariff engineer reclassifying, but you just want to, it's also compliance related, right? Like as we mentioned in the beginning, making sure you're using the correct classification. So so I would say if you do decide to correct it, then it will result in additional duties due to customs. All right.
And another one for you, Jenn. In how many days can we file a PSC?
So a PSC can generally be filed. PSC for everyone is post-summary correction, and that is a type of correction method with customs. There are 3 different methods: post-summary correction, protest, and a prior disclosure. Post-summary correction is more of an administrative correction, and that is available for unliquidated entries. And so the window to file a PSC is generally within 300 days of the entry date. All right, let's see. Many similar HTS codes are differentiated by the value of the relevant good. Just to confirm, is the value of the good at the time of import, in other words, the price paid to the factory overseas?
So the value that's being referred to there is going to be the CI value. So what's listed on the invoice. And you have to practice reasonable care when determining what the value of a product is. You don't want to, grossly undervalue the product to result in a different duty because that would not be practicing reasonable care.
Okay.
And Jenn, how far back can you go to get a refund if you reclassify your product and there is a savings?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, there's several different processes for correction: the post-summary correction and the protest. So if you're getting a refund, so your correction results in a lower duty and customs, and you're requesting a refund of those duties from customs, you have roughly around 100 or 300 days for PSCs, 180 days for a protest after liquidation. So you're looking about a year and a half-ish at most that you can receive refunds. So if that's why we say if you think you have any incorrect classifications or you're looking for a tariff engineering opportunity, you may want to do that sooner rather than later because if you think that you can change historical entries, the timeline is ticking. So you want to make sure if you want to optimize the amount of refunds you can get, you just want to get that started sooner rather than later. Yeah.
Awesome. It looks like we're running out of time. So that concludes today's webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. If we didn't get to your question, please contact us at classification@flexport.com. We will email everyone a link to the recording tomorrow morning. And again, if you want to get in contact with us, it's classification@flexport.com. Thank you again and have a great day.